Yeah, it's fun. Now, here's what you know, right? You have these like unique skill sets and giftings that you had probably from the time that you were a kid, right? I mean, some of you picked up on things that you were really good at when you were young. Like if you're a painter, you're probably painting pretty young. Some of you maybe start speaking languages when you were pretty young. And here's what's so fascinating is that the younger that you are, that you discover some of the things that you're good at, it's really exciting, especially if you're like a small pool of people, because you can feel like you're really kind of a big deal. Like I remember I was a really great basketball player at my middle school. And then as soon as I got to high school, then I realized maybe not quite as good as I thought I was. You know what I mean? Like there's a little bit of that. There's a little bit of the things that you might be good at and you realize like, hey, I have these unique giftings and skill sets. And then something on the other side of this begins to happen. At some point along the way, you realize you might be good at it, but maybe you're not quite as good at it as somebody else. And then something very interesting begins to happen that really messes with your brain is you might be good at something, and then all of a sudden, you fail at it for the first time. Like, any of you, how many of you are in the room are like really good at math? Do we have any like math people, numbers people, however you would say that? All right, how many of you are like on the other side of it? You're on the writing. Yeah, you're like me, or like numbers. Yeah, okay. Yeah, so you get this, like some of you remember being really good at some of those things, and all of a sudden, the first time that you just didn't quite get it. Like I loved math, I was really good at it until they started putting letters in it. And I was like, I don't know why y'all doing that. That's weird. You know what I mean? There's a little bit of this where you start, and then all of a sudden you have these moments where you start failing. Like some of you, you've seen this with athletes where they're really good at it, but then all of a sudden they'll get in their heads, and then all of a sudden they fail at it, and then it's almost like a spiral. This is my Atlanta Braves this season, right? Like there's a little bit of that where you just kind of feel some of those things. And failure is really interesting, especially when you start failing at things that you're good at, because failing starts messing with your head. And we live in a culture that when you fail at things that you're bad at, there's probably a little bit of like, okay, but then when you start failing at things that you're good at, it actually starts doing something inside of you, right? And our culture, right, we talk about this from the time that we're kids. Like anytime we fail, like one of the things that we focus on is like, how do we fix the failure, right? Nobody just gets to fail and then just be just failing. Like you fail and then you got to fix it. I remember growing up, if I made wrong choices on a test, sometimes we get the opportunity to go back and fix the work. Did you ever see this before? Like you go back and redo it. And then I had one teacher who was like, and if you draw on the paper, and I was like, I'll take all the extra credit points I can get. So I just put all these stick men on it, whatever. Like you get all these sort of things where you go back and fix it. We never just let failure be. Failure is just something we've got to like fix and overcome, right? And the other part of our culture that's also fascinating is you don't just fail. Like you fail, and then oftentimes we're trying to like hide weakness. You ever seen this before too? So you experience this at work, where you can project confidence and you can project that you're good at something. You can hide your failures to an extent, but you don't really let people see your weakness. Or on the other side of this, and this is like the real fun, like honest part of it, some of you let just enough weakness show to appear vulnerable, but not the weaknesses that actually matter to you. You know what I'm saying? Like you can be really good at being vulnerable and really good at still hiding the deeper weaknesses that you have. But at the end of the day, like vulnerability is not something that often gets celebrated, at least genuine vulnerability, right? Some of you are leaders in the room and you know this. Like you're very good at appearing like a good leader and even appearing vulnerable at times, but it's always controlled vulnerability. It's always like the thing behind the thing that lurks there, you're still really good at hiding those sort of weaknesses. And we celebrate that. Like we don't celebrate on the other side of that. And the other one is this, and you see this in all different types of our culture. Oftentimes there's this need to appear flawless, right? Like you see this in so many different areas, but we might celebrate vulnerability to an extent, but on the other side of it, what we really want or what we really see or project is this sense of being flawless. Like we do this on Instagram pictures, right? And we do this as a family. I always laugh. Like we don't always post the 94 versions of the picture when, one of the kids is throwing grass at the other one and the other one's, it's usually Eleanor punching our 6-year-old Henry, you know what I mean? Like she's, like whatever that is. We post a picture of everybody smiling and just enough filters and whatever it is, like just so we, there's appearing sort of flawless. And you see this, right? You see this all over the place. So there's appearing flawless. Now, what undergirds all of that is a sense that we want to both be successful, and appear like we're doing well. But under all of that is a thing where oftentimes what we actually feel day in and day out is that we're just kind of unqualified or disqualified, right? Like there's no guilt quite like mom guilt when you read mommy blogs or you see those Instagram posts. Like, you know what I'm talking about? Like I'm not a mom, obviously, but there's a piece of you that just goes like, oh, I never quite measure up. We talked about jealousy earlier in the series, but this is a little bit different because Jealousy looks out and kind of like wishes you had what somebody else has. Feeling unqualified or disqualified, it's like looking deeply into yourself and seeing the actual flaws that exist and then wondering, what do you do with it, right? It's like when you look at failure and there's no other excuse except for the fact that you failed, right? There's nothing else there except that it's yours. Like it's yours to carry. Like you did it. Some of you created messes in your life, and you look at your life mess and you go like, this isn't anybody else's fault. Like this isn't for somebody else to blame. This is mine. And what I feel is unqualified for whatever the future might hold. Whatever I feel is disqualified for whatever the future might hold. And some of you know what it's like to dream big dreams or to have big sort of grand visions for your life and those kinds of things. And you look out, and if you're really honest, like when you're quiet and you look in the mirror or you're staring at the ceiling fan and you're not projecting anything, you're not trying, and you're not, doing any of those things. When it's just you, and it's just you with you, there's a piece of us that if we were really honest about it, we project out into the future at this point in our life and go, I don't know if I can actually experience what I wanted to experience for the rest of my life. And we don't like to talk about that, and we certainly don't like to feel those things. But at the end of the day, it's like, what do we do with that? Like, what do we do when we feel unqualified and we are? What do we do when we feel disqualified and we are disqualified in some ways in what we feel in those moments? Because that brokenness almost feels like it has power over our future. Right? We say it this way, that our brokenness has felt like it breaks our dreams in some ways. And it's not that you don't fast forward and see good things. It's that you fast forward and don't see the things that you feel most called to. Or you fast forward and you don't see the things that you most desire in your life. And so here's what a lot of people do, right? And nobody ever talks about this, and we can project all sorts of different things. But just for a minute, let's just all pretend that we're 100% honest and we're not in church and you're not lying, you're not projecting anything. Like, there's a piece of us that settles into a comfort enough state. Some of us, that's in our jobs. Some of that's in our relationships. Some of that is in our friendships. Some of that's in our marriages or with our kids. And we settle into a comfort enough state to where we can project at least to the point that we feel safe. But we don't actually dream for things that are beyond whatever that safety is. And this is where people that are followers of Jesus, this is so fascinating, is you get to that place and you're so focused inward on your own failure or brokenness or struggle or pain that a lot of times the doubt and questioning about whether God is good, it settles in, right? Some of you, if you're really blunt, if you're really honest, what you're actually frustrated with is God, because God could have made you different, or God could have made you seem different or smarter, or like whatever any of those things are, but it seems like he didn't. And you're sitting there with a version of brokenness that's painful. And I put it in my notes, I said it this way. I was like, we hide within the perceived comfort that's actually away from our calling. It's actually away from the thing that we feel most called or drawn to or put here to do. Now, there's a version of this that you kind of get, and this is where it's fun, and especially with preachers like me. You get to this kind of fork in the road at this point where you preach one of two sermons, and it depends on the kind of church that you're part of, these places. Some churches then go, so think all the right things and ignore the brokenness and da-da-da-da-da, and you just go this way, and it just doesn't exist, right? If you can believe it right, have enough faith, muster it enough, then you're going to get that thing, right? And that's one version of people that talk about this, and it always frustrates me, and I'm sitting there trying not to yell back at the pastor because I don't want to get escorted out. I'm just kidding-ish. But then there's another version of talking about this, right? And the other version of talking about this, that it focuses so much on you that when you look at your brokenness, it's like you look at your brokenness and then you're just left there, right? And all you do is just see your brokenness and pain. And at the end of the day, it just feels a little bit hopeless. Like the bottom line for the message is to say, you suck. Thanks so much for coming. Like that's the end of the talk, you know? And then it just ends. And for a lot of Christianity, it's just these two versions. You can be better, and you can be better on your own if you just think the right things, believe the right things, and muster up enough faith. Or you just can't deal with it. And there's a version of that. And then there's a little bit of talk over here like, oh, it's going to be okay. But at the end of the day, the message is, so sorry. You're just in your sin. And that's the end of it. And the problem with that is that both of them kind of have a little bit of merit, but neither one of them are the full picture, right? You don't just get to think the right things and think that all of a sudden it's just good for your life. That's not what happens. And at the end of the day, you can't just wallow in the brokenness to the point that you never move forward, or you'll just be paused your whole life, right? And so what I want to do is I want to take a few minutes and talk about this sort of complexity, and it is a complexity. And in some ways, it feels like a dichotomy of like, how do these things exist with one another? So let's talk about the first part of it. The first part of it is this: that we have to look at our brokenness, and I put in my notes, I said this, that understanding the depth of my brokenness actually allows me to experience the extent of his grace. And let me tell you what I mean by this. As much as we might be prone to ignore the brokenness that either we've created or that exists within us and just move on beyond it, you can only move on beyond it to a certain point. And here's why. Because you can only lie to yourself to a certain point and still make progress. You can only ignore whatever it is that you've done to a certain point and still move forward. You can't just fix it without acknowledging the brokenness that exists there. And this is uncomfortable. And in Western culture, again, we don't love to talk about this. What happens is that at the end of the day, we actually have to face whatever that brokenness is because it points to something that is actually beyond us. Now, we're going to talk about the second half of this in just a few minutes, but as we get to that, we're going to be looking at the life of a guy named Peter today. And a lot of you know probably a little bit about Peter. Peter is one of Jesus' closest followers. What's fun about the context of Jesus' closest followers, and this kind of gets missed a lot, is that they were brought up from the time that they were little kids to be on a trajectory to follow a rabbi. So these young Jewish boys are brought up, and what happens is the best of the best of the best of the best end up becoming these sort of disciples of a rabbi. So Jesus was a rabbi, he went around and he taught. He had a group of disciples. We talk about that, and a lot of us only have context for that with Jesus, but there's a lot of rabbis at the time who had a set of disciples, and they were young boys who kind of came into early manhood that would become sort of, one of these followers. Now, what's interesting about the disciples that Jesus picked is that all of them had come up and then gotten to a certain point of the journey where they weren't good enough to become whatever it was to be a person who was a follower of a rabbi. What happens to those Jewish boys is then they would go and essentially take on some version of the family business or some form of work in the community, but they wouldn't get to follow the rabbi. So what Jesus does is when he goes around and he picks a lot of these guys, he goes to the place where they had kind of been progressed through and then gone back to start working and begin their life working in those ways. And he meets them where they're working at these places and calls out of them a new purpose and sees something in them and calls something out of them to be a follower of him. And so all of his are like, it's kind of funny. It's like the bad news bears just a little bit. Like everybody else would have had the smartest and the brightest and and then Jesus walking around with guys like Peter who was like, well, what'd you do before this? He's like, I fished. That was it. It was a little bit. That was a bit of it. And so what happens is they follow Jesus around. Jesus does these extraordinary things. Like from a practical sense, Jesus was obscure for most of his life, comes into sort of prominence in large part because he was healing people. And he starts healing people, and people start showing up to see the miracles. He starts breaking bread, and they broke it like 12,000 times. And everybody gets fed, and like, what happened? And all these miracles, and people just keep coming and coming, not just for Jesus' teaching, even though they were coming to see him do things. And these disciples had seen him do miraculous things over and over and over and over again. And then all of a sudden, through this process, he begins to teach on what this new kingdom was going to be. He begins to call himself God, which again messed up the sort of religious entities at the time. And this became this whole big thing. And a lot of you know this. He then becomes crucified. They end up capturing him, killing him as a criminal. And here's what's so fascinating about this, with his closest followers, is he calls his shot. He essentially looks at them and tells them, he's going to be killed. He's going to rise from the dead. And here's what's so funny. They capture him. And then 3 days go by, he goes to the tomb, he raises from the grave, and none of his closest followers are waiting on him, which is always funny to me because I'm like, if you see somebody heal somebody, that's interesting. Or if you see somebody break bread that many times and feed that many people and it's a miracle, like, it's interesting. None of his closest followers, including Peter, are waiting around at the tomb. Every time we talk about this, I say the same thing. If I deeply believe that somebody's going to raise out of a grave and I knew around the time when it's going to happen, I'm pulling up a lawn chair, I'm getting my Snicker bars, I'm getting a lot of sweet tea. I'm going to sit there, I'm going to look at the guard and be like, you're about to have a bad day. I'm just going to sit there and wait, None of them were. And what's fascinating about the New Testament, if you haven't read this, is so beautiful, is the least likely preachers to proclaim the gospel would have been the women who would have been disqualified in a lot of ways, right? And that's the first people who come and tell Jesus' closest followers that he's not dead anymore and that he rose from the dead. And so after all of this, you have Jesus then revealing himself to people. Now, what's interesting specifically about Peter, and then we'll jump into the text, is in the process of Jesus being captured, Peter is that friend who like steps out and says things a little bit too fast. How many of you have that friend? Anybody have that friend that they just speak up before they probably should most of the time? Anybody? How many of you are that friend? Just be honest. Don't lie. Like, you're here. Yeah. You're like, absolutely. I'm speaking up right now. You know, like, there's a little bit of that. Peter was that. His gumption pushed him forward. And so Peter's the one going, hey, I'm going to follow you no matter what happens. And he's trying to cut people's ear. I'm like, oh, this guy's like, and what's so funny is that then once Jesus is captured and pulled away from the group, then all of a sudden, Peter's kind of lurking behind, seeing what's going to happen. And we have these accounts. And a lot of scholars would say they were middle school age girls who start looking at Peter and going, wait, weren't you the guy that was like one of his followers? Weren't you one of those disciples? And Peter's like, no, that was my doppelganger. It's not me. It's somebody else. You know what I mean? He's like pushing it aside. And he doesn't do this just once. He does it 3 times. 3 times he denies Christ and that he was with him. And so all of that happens. He essentially goes into hiding. All of Jesus' disciples kind of go into hiding, raised from the dead. Women see him. Women start telling him all about it. And then what happens next is this interaction between Jesus and a handful of these close followers. And that's where we're going to pick up today. And we're going to be in John chapter 21. Here's what it says. It says, Simon Peter, Thomas, Nathanael, and the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples were all together. So they're all hanging out together. And I love what happens, right? They kind of go into hiding, but they don't just go into hiding. They were called from their like previous work of being fishermen into being these like close followers of a rabbi, Jesus with this high status sort of thing. And as soon as Jesus gets captured, they kind of go back to what they were doing before, right? And so what happens next, it says this. They go, hey, what are we going to do? It's like, hey, we're going to go out to fish. That's what Peter said. We're going to go out to fish, which is what they did before. And then they go, hey, that's a great idea. We'll just all go with you. And so they went out, they get in the boat, and this is fascinating. I love this detail in the text. And they got in the boat that night, and they didn't catch anything. And that's pretty rare. Like that would be unlikely for you to go out into that sea at that time frame with these very skilled fishermen and not catch anything. And the fascinating part about this is these guys who were then, these sort of like, how do you say this? It's kind of like the group of, it's like U2. Do we have any U2 fans in the room? Do we have any U2 fans? Right. So Bono is U2, right? Bono. But the Edge is right there. You know, everybody still knows who the Edge is. You know what I mean? It's kind of like if Bono disappears and the Edge is like, here's what I'm going to go do. I'm going to go flip some burgers. You know what I mean? It's a little bit of that. I'm going to go back doing what I was going to do. It's a terrible example, but I love the Edge. Hearts. Anyway, so you get that. But they go back to doing what they were doing before. Peter goes back to just, put it in mind, he's just fishing. And it's like all of a sudden they have this death of a dream where they were going and what they believed that Jesus was going to do. And he was going to be the savior, and in a military sort of sense, he was going to come help free this group of people to do something and experience something they haven't experienced in a long, long time. They had all these expectations and every reason to believe that Jesus was going to come through. And it seems like he didn't. I put in mind to say it this way. It's like the death of a dream or a vision for the future often causes us, and it certainly caused them, to go back to the life that they lived before, which is some version of a life of comfort, and just settling into whatever that is. So what happens next is kind of fun and slightly mystical, and it's really powerful. They kind of assume he's dead, and then they get out there, and the next verse, in verse 21, says this. It says, early in the morning, after they've been fishing sort of all night, Jesus stands on the shore. So picture this. They're like out in the boat, and off to the shore, roughly about 100, 150 yards away. There's Jesus standing on the shore, sort of calling out to them. But the disciples didn't realize that it was Jesus. And he calls out to them. He says, friends, haven't you had any fish? Which I think is so much fun because he knew. Friends, don't you have any fish? And they yell back, no, we didn't catch anything. And what Jesus says next, again, one of these like fascinating details that John gives, he yells back. He says, all right, we'll do this. Throw your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some. Which that would have led to some sort of discussion because you don't throw it on the right side of the boat, especially at that time frame. Jesus is going like, do it the opposite way, even the way that doesn't seem like it's going to work. And they must have been so desperate after a night of not having their mojo of fishing, you know? They come back and say, when they did, they were unable to haul the net in because of the large number of fish. It's like they didn't catch anything. All of a sudden, they do it in a way that it doesn't make any sense because Jesus told them to. They didn't even know it was Jesus. They do it. Now they have this massive group of fish. And what happens next is so fun and weird and powerful. Because what it says next, it says, then the disciple whom Jesus loved, which is likely John, says to Peter, it is the Lord. He recognizes that it's Jesus. And as soon as Simon Peter heard him say, it is the Lord, something happens to Peter. And what he does is he does this. He wraps his outer garment around him, for he had taken it off. And he jumps in the water. Now, this isn't like some short swim. This is around 100, 150 yards. He gets in the water and just Michael Phelpses it towards Jesus. It's really powerful what happens next, because as much gumption as Peter had, as many times he had these moments where he would say things and you go, oh, he's it ranges from get behind me, Satan, to we're going to build this whole thing on you, the rock. There's a little bit of these two extremes with Peter. But at every moment of that journey, he also appears to be one of the point leaders of this group of people that follow Jesus. And at no point was he not in some version of that leader. But that leader went back to fishing after Jesus was caught. He went back to doing his old stuff, and he stepped back from that calling, but he jumps out of the boat inspired by the fact that Jesus is on the shore and swims. And what happens next is beautiful and powerful. It says this, then the other disciples followed him. I love this. Because think about it, 100 yards, you're not sure what you're looking at. You're curious, yeah. And Peter jumps out of the boat, and he goes first, head first. And the disciples followed him, towing the net full of fish. And they were not far from the shore, about 100 yards. And when they had landed, they saw a fire of burning coals there with fish on it and some bread. And the thing that I think is so beautiful about this is, as much as Peter moved back towards that life that he had had before, Peter was still a leader throughout every step of this journey. Even in the midst of the deep failure, when you don't ever want to follow the person who was that afraid of something that feels so small. How would you follow the person who had that little faith in the one who had done miracle after miracle after miracle, and then when it seemed like it gets hard, he just disappears? But he's that leader. It's almost like Peter had all of this doubt that Jesus actually was who he said that he was, because he wasn't waiting for Jesus to raise from the dead. He was hiding in fear for his own life and himself. So what happens is they get to the shore, and I don't know how it works, but there's food and there's fish and they're eating, and it's this group of guys, a handful of guys, spending time with Jesus. And at some point, the conversation with this group of people shifts towards Peter. And it's Jesus and it's Peter. And what happens is one of these really rare, odd, overly human moments that if you blink, you sort of miss it in the text. But it's so beautiful. It says this. John's account of the conversation is this, that when they had finished eating, Jesus says to Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? And Peter's response is, yeah, you know I love you. You know how I know that you know that I love you? Because you know all things, so you must know that I love you. And what Jesus does is Jesus doesn't focus just on the love part. He starts focusing on reinstating purpose into the heart of this man. So Jesus responds with, you're going to feed my lambs, which is a weird way of saying, in some ways for us, weird. Hey, you're going to go do the thing that really you were put here to do. Go do that. Peter was reminded of his calling and essentially reinstated with his purpose. And that could have been it. That could have just been it. Go do the thing that you were put here to do. But what's interesting in my mind is he says it again. And he says to him, hey, do you love me? A second time. And then you get Peter going, of course, you know that I love you. And then Jesus responds, okay, then you're going to take care of my sheep. You're going to become the shepherd of this, Peter would have known at the time, this early church sort of thing. And Jesus doesn't stop at 2. He takes it to the third time. So the third time he says to him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And what happens next is fun, because it says Peter was hurt. And I think part of this is because it mirrors the fact that Jesus is going to ask, do you love me 3 times? And Peter denied him 3 times in private, way beyond. And it's the fullness of the lowest point and brokenness of Peter's life. This guy who was rejected as a young kid wasn't able to move forward and called out and given purpose by Jesus, and then follows Jesus and sees Jesus do all these things. And then the pinnacle of what's about to come from all of this, when Jesus is captured, he goes and sort of privately denies Jesus in deep fear and intimidation 3 different times. And then when Jesus reinstates him and speaks purpose over his life and redemptive nature over his life, empowerment over his life, Jesus does it not 1 time, not 2 times, but 3 times, redeems every single one of those moments. Peter's hurt. You know why Peter's hurt? Because that's the emotion that you feel when you come into view the fullness of your brokenness. When you actually come into the fullness of your brokenness, it's not like, oh, it just feels so good. It's painful. When you come face to face with the fact that it's like, oh gosh, does Jesus know? Like 3 times is like 3 times. Does he get it? Does he know? And you come face to face with one of the deepest parts of the brokenness of Peter. And Peter has to face it on the way to this redemptive nature of Jesus. So John goes on, he says, Peter was hurt because Jesus asked him this 3rd time, do you love me? And Peter, almost like in an angsty sort of way, responds, Lord, you know all things, and you know that I love you. And then Jesus again responds with this, then feed my sheep. And you have something to do. And then it's like Jesus goes off. I love. And what he says next is one of these things that, again, in our culture feels like way out there and beyond. And I don't necessarily think this specific type of thing applies to you. I don't think that. But what he's about to say to Peter is to cast vision over where his life will end up and what will come. And it's messy and it's hard and it's weird for us to even think about it in these terms. But he's about to cast vision for this rock that some of this will be built on. He says this. He says, very truly I tell you that when you were younger, you dressed yourself and you went where you wanted. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands and someone else will dress you and lead you to where you do not want to go. Which is this interesting way of Jesus talking about how Peter would eventually go and in a lot of ways launch this early church movement with a lot of disciples, and Paul's going to get involved and get with Gentiles and people who are non-Jewish, and it's going to explode all over the ancient world. But Peter would be a part of leading that. And at the end of that, and this is what's so powerful and messy and beautiful, is that he wouldn't just help lead all that, but it's like, to what extent would he lead it? And Jesus says this, or John says this of what Jesus says. He says this. He says, Jesus said this to indicate the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. Which is, again, weird for us to talk about and think about. But the crux of this, or the bones of this, is this guy who was so intimidated by these 3 young girls at the moment where Jesus would be taken away and killed. Jesus reinstates his purpose, speaks deeply into who this person is. And it almost says he would be so empowered by what's to come and so filled with courage that's not his own and lived almost so far beyond his own current limitations as a human being. And God would do something so miraculous through him as to build the early church. And with that level of confidence, he'd even be willing to lay down all of his life for it. And then Jesus gives us the 2 words, I think are the same 2 words for us. And he says this. He says, follow me. With everything else that you've done, with all this stuff, as you think about where you're going to go and the empowerment that was about to come, what you're to do is to come, follow me. Right. So here's the bottom line, and then we're going to wrap up here in just a second. That's this, that Jesus meets us where we are, and he calls us to trust and follow. Now, the second part of this is like the churchy one that we kind of get. It's like, yeah, I get it. Trust and follow Jesus. That's great. I think the first part is actually the more painful part. And that's that Jesus meets us where we are. A lot of times you assume that you have to clean up your life to a certain extent before that Jesus can get involved in it, or that you have to get enough things right, or you got to clean up this sort of thing. This is what's so fascinating about the gospel and the redemptive work of Christianity that's very different than every other religion, is it doesn't say, here's your X amount of things to get to where you need to be before Jesus gets involved. What's interesting is it's the moment that we turn and face Jesus open-handedly and invite him in, that's the moment that he meets us. There isn't like you turn and then you got 6 steps and then all of a sudden Jesus shows up somewhere along the line. It's like you turn, and when you turn, you're facing the redemptive and powerful work of Jesus. That it's not turn and then do more, it's turn and receive. It's turn and experience what is yours. It's turn and understand that the redemptive work of God is for every person to experience. It's as we turn and see that he is waiting there for us to trust him. And this is what's so interesting. And we're brought up in a very different mindset of going, you got to clean this up. You got to do this thing. You got to get right. You got to da-da-da-da. And that's all great. And you can work for those things. But at the end of the day, what Jesus is saying is when you turn and you face him, his redemptive work allows you the grace that you need to live from his place of freedom and love and grace. And it's from that place that we experience the life that he's called us to live, which means that if you feel unqualified or if you feel disqualified in areas of your life, don't miss this. It's not that all of a sudden you blink and magically everything's right. And it's not that you magically blink and all the things that you did don't exist anymore. That's not true at all. And it's not that you blink and all of a sudden it just doesn't matter and you can just go live your life the way you want to do it. No. It's when we look at our brokenness in its fullness and we turn to Jesus and we say, hey, here's all of it. This is all of me. You can use all of me, but this is the broken parts. Here I am. This is what's so powerful about the gospel. He meets us exactly where we are, and then the limits that we have fall in the hands of a limitless God who meets us there. And so as much as I wanted to end this series and end this talk with the 9 steps to experience the whatever, I don't have it. I have this, that at the end of the day, he wants to meet you exactly where you are. And you either choose to believe that or you don't. Or you choose to hold on tightly to the things that you're gripping or you don't. Or you play it safe. And playing it safe is being really good at doing this. You can see these things, but you don't get this one. You have these things, but you don't get this, right? It's waiting until you feel qualified, but you're not and you're never going to, and it's not there. It's waiting until you feel like you're not disqualified anymore, but come on. Your sin and my sin is to the point where we are. Come on. Anything that God uses in us is a grace that he gives us, right? So I put it in my notes, and it's a little bit unsettling, but I said this way, that being unqualified, when you look at the scriptures, is actually, it seems to be one of God's qualifications, right? I don't know why. I don't know that I would do it that way. But luckily for the world, I'm not God. You know what I mean? I don't know. He takes people who are disqualified or unqualified and does extraordinary things through them. And you get these moments where people do extraordinarily bad things. I would never want them around my kids. And then you get these moments in the text where it's and that's a man after God's own heart. It's but rape and murder, you know what I mean? You got and then he becomes king. What? You got all these moments where you get guys like Peter. Come on, I'd be pissed at Peter. Come on, behind the scenes, you deny me to middle school girls, you felt intimidated by it? And Jesus leans in and goes, no, watch what I'm going to do through the brokenness that's in you. The unqualified part often is it almost seems to be a qualifying factor for people. And here's how you know this. You ready? You know this. People who don't face their brokenness, you don't like anyway. So you kind of already like this, right? People who appear like they have it all together, but you know that they don't, it turns you off. But it's the people who are centered enough in the pain and the broken. Come on, you know this. There's something about that draws you in. And God leverages that for his benefit. And the second thing is this. And this thing, if I can convince every follower of Jesus of this, and it's so hard. And I said it earlier, a version of it. But your limits are nothing in the hands of a limitless God. It's just not. Your limits are nothing in the hands of a limitless God. And every person that you most admire who did extraordinary things had limits. And it's the lid was supernaturally lifted in some way. Now, please don't miss this. Now, I don't know if you're going to go be the president of a country. I don't know what that is. Or you're going to be the next face. I don't know what you're going to do. But most of us were put here to do something that God has already revealed to us in some way. And the older that you get, there's something about us that starts playing it a little bit safer, a little bit easier, a little bit stop dreaming for the future, a little bit more 401-ness, right? A little bit more I got to make sure my kids are taken care of. A little bit more I act as if God doesn't hold the world in the palm of his hand. A little bit less God could do something through me in my own brokenness. A little bit less like that. And so I'm going to tell you again, if you're a follower of Jesus, the thing that I wish I could just do for every person is to go, whatever you think your limits are may be true. Whatever your brokenness is may be true. Whatever disqualifies you may be true, and whatever makes you feel like you're unqualified may be true. But thank God it's not up to you. It's up to you in partnership with the God of the universe, who there is no limit for. And somewhere along the way, some of you are 25 or 35 or 45 or 85, and you just stop dreaming for what a limitless God could do through your life. And I think more than anything, it's sad because you could get to 85 or 90 or 95 or 100 years old and live a really good life that's void of the power and the beauty of a calling that comes to God and says, what do you want to do through me? What I most hope for people that attend our church isn't that you just come and become a great church person. You're already good at that. You showed up today at 11 o'clock, right? There's a football game a little bit later. Let's be honest. Most of you are hungry because I've been talking so long. I get that. Like, you're here. I get it. You're already a good church, whatever. You're here. I want you mobilized for the unique calling that God has placed on your life. And you only get that when you recognize your own brokenness and at the other side of it, invite God to meet you in it and do what only he can do. And so the question for you, and this is like the real, like it feels manipulative and it's not. I don't think, I'm not trying to make it manipulative. The real question for you is what hangs in the balance of your family and your giftedness, your work, and the stewardship of you being a leader. What hangs in the balance of you being your own lid and not inviting God to do what only God can do? I put in my notes this way. What is God calling you to do that you feel uniquely qualified for? What is that? What's that thing that he's like, and some of you, it's like a tiny seed. You don't even know, but like it exists. What is that thing that he's uniquely gifted you and qualified you for? And the second question, this is just a really honest one, right? And this is something you choose, is will you trust him? And sometimes trusting him comes with like this like white-knuckled fist thing of like this thing that I'm not ready to give up yet, but I mean, yeah, it's great. But will you trust him and then just see what he'll do? And here's what I promise you. At the ripe old age of 35 and all of my wisdom, I'm not even 35 yet, I'm 34. It's great. Start adding years at some point, I don't know. Is that if you do that, at the end of your life, you'll be so much more at peace and centered, knowing that you gave the fullness, even though it feels broken, of your potential and gifting to him, and ask him to take it and do what Jesus did with every single miracle that he did. He just breaks it and he makes more and he multiplies and he does extraordinary things. Will you trust him? So here's where we're going to wrap up and we're going to end our time. For those of you in the room and you're not a follower of Jesus, this feels very like out there, and there's like 9 steps that you would probably feel like you need to get to before you could believe that not only the God of the universe is personal, but that he's personal with you and he has a plan for your life and he wants to do something with it. I totally get those things. My question for you, if you're not a follower of Jesus, is going to be, what is the lid that you currently experience that you haven't been able to break through, not because of your gifting or talent, but because you just simply couldn't? And here's like the prayer that I tell people to pray all the time, and I really frustrate some of my pastor friends when I do this, but I don't care. It's this. Pray the prayer to the ceiling that goes like, if you're up there, do this. And it's like, well, you can't test God. I'm like, I guess that is true to an extent, but at the same time, I think he's going like, I think I want to show you, right? And I think there's a moment where you can go, God, if you're up there, I don't know what to do with all this, but it would be great if this part of the lid were removed and I could see something. And then tangibly watch how your giftedness and talent or financial resource or whatever it is doesn't get you there, but something beyond you does. And if that happens, and as you move into that space, begin to ask yourself the question, then what is it? One of the best questions that you can ask, then what is it, right? And the second one is for those of you who are followers of Jesus, and come on, you've just played your life in terms of like playing your hand as if God weren't going to get involved in it. Come on, here's my challenge. Invite him to get involved. Stop relying just on you and invite him to get involved. God, here's the extent, here's my lid in leadership. Help me to break through that and watch him do it. Here's my lid with my family. Here it is. Invite him to get involved in that thing. Here's my lid. Involved. And watch what he does as you give him, not just in a prayer that you prayed when you were 7 years old, but tangibly give him your life. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pray for us, and we'll wrap up, and we'll go from there. Let me pray for us. Father, we thank you so much for the fact that guys like John wrote this stuff down, that we can have it. And God, we thank you so much for the ways that you revealed yourself in so many different ways to us and to the world. And God, we thank you for the ways that you continue to show yourself both faithful and tangible in our lives. I pray for the person who's skeptical or not a Christian or curious about faith or might even believe that there's something out there, but they're not sure what. And God, I pray that you would help them to sort of do what we said today, is to recognize whatever their lid is or their brokenness or the things that they can't seem to get past. And God, just to invite you into it. And maybe it feels like a very broad prayer, but I pray that they would do that. And I pray that you would tangibly show up in their lives. We know you want to reveal yourself to us. And I pray that as you do that, it creates so much restlessness in them that it forces them to dive deeper into what is true and what isn't about Christianity, and that you would speak so clearly to them. And God, I pray for the people in the room that are followers of you, and they're followers of you in a lot of ways, but maybe not every way. And there comes a point in their life where it feels like their life has taught them to play it safe in some way. God, I think you call most all of us to a version of risk. And I pray that you would reveal that to us. You would inspire the kind of faith in us that goes beyond us and actually trusts you. And God, beyond all that, I ask that every person here and every person who's going to watch this online, every person who's sitting in a Starbucks right now and watching this, and I ask that you would do this. I pray that you would mobilize us in such a clear and unique way that we make the unique difference that you call us to make. And in the moments when we drift back and we stop trusting you and put our emphasis on our own efforts, our strength, our striving, God, I pray that you would help us in those moments to pause and turn and face you and remember that you are right there when we turn, and that you would empower us through your Holy Spirit to do what it is that you've called us to do individually, corporately. God, that you would help us to do that and become who you've called us to be. It's in Jesus' name.